When a storm rolled through the city one night, a kind-hearted nurse opened his door to a shivering stranger. He didn't know her name. He didn't ask for credentials. He only saw someone in need and offered warmth. What he didn't know was that she was the runaway daughter of one of the most powerful men in America. And by offering her shelter, he became a target of unimaginable cruelty, threats, lies, surveillance. They tried to destroy his life for doing the right thing. But they made one mistake. They picked the wrong man to underestimate. What followed wasn't just a battle for survival. It was the blueprint for taking down an empire, using nothing but truth, love, and a cell phone full of receipts. It began with thunder rolling low over the city skyline and rain slicing across pavement like glass. One of those storms that seemed to wash everything clean, even the invisible burdens people carried. Marcus Hayes, 36, a single black father and registered trauma nurse, had just ended another exhausting night shift at St. Elmo Medical when he noticed a silhouette slumped against the shelter wall across from his apartment. Drenched and shaking, she looked like she'd been running not just from the storm, but from the world. Some might have kept walking, but Marcus wasn't built that way. He lived by instincts honed from years in public care systems, years learning how to read people's pain even when they said nothing. So when he stepped under the awning and said gently, "You all right?" the young woman looked up, blinking water from her eyes. "I lost my wallet, my phone. I don't know where else to go." She told him her name was Ella, said she was a college student, stranded after a party turned bad, and no one picked up her calls. She didn't ask to be invited in, but she didn't need to. Marcus saw the desperation in her eyes and remembered too many nights when kindness had been the only thing standing between him and despair. So he brought her inside, offered her dry clothes, food, and a place on the couch in his tiny two-bedroom apartment where his 7-year-old daughter Amira was already fast asleep under a blanket decorated with cartoon planets. He didn't know that one small act of human decency would detonate into a war. He didn't know Ella was really Evelyn Grant, daughter of real estate mogul Barrett Grant, a man whose face adorned skyscraper billboards and charity galas and whose name made courtrooms tremble. But for that night, none of it mattered. What mattered was that she was scared, wet, and human, and Marcus had always believed that was enough to deserve kindness. The next morning, Evelyn didn't leave, nor the next. Days stretched into a week, and the strange tension between them began to soften. She helped Amira with homework, folded laundry without being asked, and offered to cook simple meals. She didn't act entitled. She acted grateful. She acted like she belonged. Marcus assumed she was just one of countless girls from fractured families looking for a place to breathe. If he had known her last name, he might have handled things differently. But maybe not. Maybe that's the part of Marcus that made him dangerous to people like Barrett Grant. He treated everyone with the same compassion, regardless of their zip code or stock portfolio. For 2 weeks, they lived as a quiet trio. Evelyn opened up, slowly, about being tired of expectations, of being treated like a brand, not a person. Amira adored her. "She smells like lilacs," she whispered to Marcus one night, "and she tells good stories." But nothing gold stays, and one rainy Thursday morning, Evelyn was gone. No dramatic goodbye, no forwarded mail, just a handwritten thank you note tucked beside Amira's cereal bowl. I needed this more than you'll ever know. For Marcus, it was closure. For Barrett Grant, it was a declaration of war. 3 days later, the phone rang. It was a voice that didn't ask questions. A voice that made threats in tones colder than steel. You really thought you could take advantage of my daughter and get away with it? Said Barrett Grant. You're going to regret the day you opened that door. The line went dead, but the threat didn't. Marcus Hayes stood in his tiny kitchen, hands still clutching the phone, trying to steady the storm now swirling in his own chest. Across the room, Amira peeked around the corner in her pink pajamas. Rubbing her eyes, Daddy, who was yelling? He forced a smile. Just someone who made a mistake, he said, tucking the phone into his pocket and ruffling her curls. But in truth, he knew what had just happened. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a declaration. Barrett Grant, the billionaire. Behind thousands of condos, office parks, and land deals, had just decided Marcus was a threat. And he didn't plan to fight fair. The first strike came swiftly. The next day, Marcus was summoned to a closed-door meeting at St. Elmo Medical. His supervisor, avoiding eye contact, handed him a document citing anonymous complaints about inappropriate behavior with a minor. A security escort was already waiting to accompany him out of the building. It's temporary, she said, flatly, but pending investigation, you're suspended without pay. Hours later, back at his apartment, he watched in stunned silence as 2 officers and a court-appointed investigator rifled through his belongings under a vague court order. No explanations, no context, just accusation wrapped in legal muscle. Amira clung to his leg, watching her world get torn apart piece by piece. But Marcus didn't panic, not outwardly. He had survived wars, grew up in state homes where adults were either absent or abusive, learned early to document everything, to keep receipts when no one believed a word you said. He had survived a system built to grind people like him into dust, and he had developed a habit that was now about to become his shield: documentation. What Barrett Grant didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined, was that Marcus had recorded everything. Not because he was suspicious, but because working night shifts in a hospital had trained him to treat even the smallest interaction like it could be evidence. He had audio logs, timestamp notes, surveillance timestamps from his apartment hallway. He had Evelyn's laughter on tape, her thanks, her voice telling Amira she felt safe. What Grant thought was a scandal waiting to explode was, in truth, a timeline of gratitude. And Marcus? He wasn't just a nurse. He was a man raised in silence who had learned that truth only survives if you protect it in plain sight. But Barrett Grant wasn't backing down. That night, just after 2 a.m., the phone rang again. See how easy it is to dismantle your pathetic little life, the billionaire hissed. By this time next week, your bank account will be frozen, your daughter kicked out of school, and you'll be out on the street. This is only the beginning. Marcus didn't say a word. The longer he stayed silent, the more Grant revealed. And every word was being recorded. My daughter is worth more than you'll ever earn in 10 lifetimes, Grant growled. People like you need to be reminded of their place. You don't get to play happy family with a Grant. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't scream, didn't even hang up. He just stood by the window, watching the city lights blink beyond the glass. What Grant didn't know was that every word was being fed into an encrypted folder on Marcus's laptop. Folder that was already backed up twice. He didn't know Marcus had allies. And he certainly didn't know that a storm was already forming, not in the sky, but in the quiet resolve of the man he thought he could crush. The morning after Grant's venomous 2 a.m. call, Marcus sat on the edge of his bed, watching Amira pack her small pink lunchbox in the kitchen with quiet precision. There were shadows under her eyes, confusion, fear, but she didn't complain. She had inherited her father's resilience, that unspoken ability to absorb chaos without letting it seep into her core. Marcus exhaled slowly, still half expecting the next hit. It came in the form of a school notification, Amira's lunch. Account had been frozen, her tuition flagged under review due to ongoing legal matters. Minutes later, a rejection notice hit his inbox from his bank. His account was suspended pending a financial audit. And in the hallway, his landlord stood awkwardly at the door, phone in hand, stammering about concerns raised and anonymous complaints. Grant wasn't just punishing Marcus. He was trying to suffocate him, bit by bit, brick by brick. But what he didn't account for was the visitor who showed up unannounced just before noon. Sandra Ellis, civil rights attorney, former hospital counsel, and the sharpest mind Marcus had ever known. She hadn't called ahead, just knocked, walked in, and dropped a leather binder on his coffee table. "I heard about the fallout," she said. "And I know who's behind it." Marcus blinked. "How?" Sandra smirked. "Because this isn't the first time, Barrett. Grant has tried to bury someone. 3 years ago, it was a teacher. Before that, a journalist. Before that, a painter in Paris. Different targets. Same playbook. Threaten, isolate, destroy." She opened the binder. Inside were court filings, settlement documents, and notes from previous victims. He uses the system like a scalpel, quiet, precise, and he always settles before it hits. The press, because all his victims think they're alone. Marcus stared at the documents, then at Amira, who was sitting cross-legged on the floor with her drawing pad, carefully sketching a house with a purple roof. "He's targeting my daughter," he said quietly. "That's not power. That's cowardice." "No," Sandra replied. "That's opportunity. Because now we know his next move before he does." Over the next 48 hours, Marcus and Sandra transformed his apartment into a war room. The walls were covered in case timelines. USB drives were labeled and sorted. Recordings were cataloged. And every threat Grant had ever made, voicemail, phone call. Even the background noise of his laugh was now legal ammunition. Sandra brought in secure cloud storage, burner phones, and contacts from her civil rights network. "We're not just defending you," she said. "We're building a case that will tear the foundation out from under his empire." Marcus, for his part, moved like a man with nothing left to lose, but everything left to protect. He didn't raise his voice, didn't rage, but his resolve was steel. Every time he looked at Amira, he remembered who he was doing this for. Not just himself, not just justice, but to show his daughter, now and always, that dignity cannot be bought, silenced, or threatened. The final moment of the day came quietly. Marcus sat at his desk, headphones on, listening to one of Grant's recorded calls from earlier that week. "You people don't belong in our world," Grant had said. You're a charity case, nothing more." Marcus paused the playback, sat in the silence, then clicked save and labeled the file Grant_failure_1. The breakthrough didn't come from a document. It came from a voice familiar, fragile, and shaking through the speakerphone just past midnight. "Marcus, I need to talk to you." It was Evelyn. The first time he'd heard her voice since she'd vanished that rainy morning. Her words came fast, desperate. "My father's telling lies about you. About Amira. He's saying horrible things. But, Marcus, it's worse than that. He's planning to plant drugs in your house. He's hiring people to make it look like you're dangerous." Sandra leaned in beside Marcus, her hand already activating a recording app on her phone. Evelyn's voice cracked. "I'm hiding in his office right now. I overheard everything. I even have some of it recorded, but he can't know. He'd destroy me too." Marcus's voice, in contrast, was calm steel wrapped in silk. "Evelyn, are you safe?" "I think so," she whispered. "I've been saving emails, messages, voice memos, everything. I didn't know what to do until now." The line cut out seconds later. But the damage had been done only this time to the man who had always struck first. Now they had an insider. For the first time, Marcus and Sandra weren't playing defense. They had an ally inside the fortress. An informant who knew every blind spot, every pressure point. They didn't waste a second. That night, Sandra tapped into her contacts. Hidden cameras were purchased and installed throughout Marcus's apartment. By dawn, motion sensors were activated. Directional microphones were embedded into picture frames. By morning, Apartment 3B had become a surveillance zone wired to record every whisper, every footstep, every lie. And they knew the storm was coming. Marcus still took Amira to school as usual, smiling as he always did, her small hand wrapped around his like ivy on brick. "You seem happier today," she said innocently. "You're not worried anymore." "Sometimes," Marcus said, "when bad people try to hurt good people, they end up falling into their own trap." Back at the apartment, Marcus and Sandra monitored the live feeds from a van parked 3 blocks away. At precisely 9:47 a.m., 2 men in utility uniforms arrived at his back door, toolboxes in hand, forged maintenance badges clipped to their shirts. "You sure the guy's out?" one of them asked on the mic. "Grant said he won't be back till noon," the other replied. "Let's make it count. Packages go in the kids' room, under the sink, and under the mattress. Then we bounce." They didn't know every word, every movement, was being broadcast live to 3 separate civil rights attorneys and an off-site paralegal team. They didn't know the district attorney had already been briefed, or that the Internal Affairs Bureau had been tipped off about the incoming false police call. At 10:05 a.m., Barrett Grant dialed the precinct himself. "Anonymous tip," he said, disguising his voice poorly. "Apartment 3B on Maple something shady. Drugs. A child might be in danger." The cops arrived, but they weren't alone. Sandra's contacts had dispatched an integrity unit. They watched the scene unfold live, the cops walking in, the fake. Tech still present, the planted drugs visible. And most damning of all, the crystal clear audio of Barrett Grant setting it all in motion. The web he'd spun had closed around his own throat. Barrett Grant's phone lit up with an unknown number at 10:43 a.m. He answered with the same smug tone he reserved for mayors and judges. "Yes, "Mr. Grant," came the cold, clipped voice of Detective Lena Morris. "This is Eastboro. Police Internal Affairs. We need to speak. Now." Silence. Then the faint sound of a throat clearing. "There must be a misunderstanding. I'm not sure who. You're under investigation for conspiracy to plant evidence, obstruction of justice, and the attempted framing of a public employee. We have live surveillance, audio files, and eyewitness testimony. This is no longer a misunderstanding. It's criminal." For the first time in decades, Barrett Grant had no words. He tried the familiar root name dropping, half promises of legal meetings and lawyers, but Morris cut him off like a guillotine. "You'll report to our office today voluntarily, or we'll come find you, with handcuffs, across town." Marcus sat in the park surveillance van with Sandra, watching the final phase of the operation play out. They didn't celebrate, not yet. Not until it was all official. But something in Sandra's voice when she leaned in and whispered, "We've got him," sent a shiver down Marcus's spine, not fear, but relief. Just after noon, news crews began to stir. Somehow, coincidentally or not, the entire story had been leaked. Sandra denied involvement. Marcus never asked. But by 6 p.m. that day, Channel 7, the Tribune, and even the Washington Herald were running top stories on the empire of intimidation, orchestrated by one of the nation's most powerful real estate moguls. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire. Caught in scheme to frame single father. Whistleblower daughter exposes family corruption." Evelyn's recordings were now evidence in a formal federal case. Her emails, voice memos, screenshots, each one another nail in the coffin of Barrett Grant's untouchable image. And in a twist of poetic justice, the same phone that Evelyn once clutched in fear now carried his downfall into every American living room. By dinner, Marcus was home, finally, with Amira beside him. She stirred a pot of mac and cheese while the television played softly in the background. "Daddy," she said, "is that the man who tried to make the police come to our house?" Marcus looked at her, nodded, then turned off the TV. "He won't be bothering us anymore." "How did you know everything would be okay?" she asked. He didn't answer right away, just crouched down to her level, looking her in the eyes. "Because sometimes," he said, "when people do terrible things, they think no one's watching. But when you tell the truth and stay calm, they end up trapping themselves. All we had to do was let them." That night, Marcus slept without waking once. No alerts, no knocks, no panic, and when he awoke, the city was quieter than usual. Or maybe, for the first time in weeks, he was just hearing it with peace in his chest. 3 weeks later, Marcus Hayes walked through the marble-floored lobby of the courthouse not as a defendant, not as a suspect, but as a key witness in one of the most explosive corruption cases Eastboro had ever seen. Sandra walked beside him, tablet under one arm, blazer sharp, voice calm. "They're trying to negotiate now," she murmured. "Barrett's attorneys are floating settlements, offers, plea deals. He's scrambling." "Let him scramble," Marcus said, not bitter, just certain. He built this, brick by brick. Inside the courtroom, things moved fast. Evelyn, now publicly using her mother's last name, Evelyn Morrison, took the stand. Her voice was steady, her words clear. "I loved my father, but I cannot excuse what he's done. I saw how he destroyed people. I heard him brag about And I have the recordings to prove it." Marcus watched from the gallery. He didn't flinch as his name was brought up, as prosecutors described him as a target of a deliberate, racially motivated intimidation campaign. He didn't look at Grant. He didn't need to. The man who once threatened to make him disappear now sat behind glass, hunched and faded. Stripped of designer suits, stripped of leverage, stripped of power. What Evelyn had exposed wasn't just illegal, it was cultural. It was generational wealth weaponized into silencers. It was the myth of immunity, shattered by a girl who chose to tell the truth and a man who refused to back down. By the end of the week, federal charges were stacked like bricks: conspiracy, obstruction of justice, falsifying evidence, coercion, and 3 civil suits by former victims, all of whom now had documentation Sandra helped them prepare using Marcus's original framework. They called it the Hayes Method in legal circles. But Marcus wasn't in court for glory. He wasn't even there for justice, not really. He was there because his daughter had to grow up knowing that when someone tried to ruin your life for doing the right thing, you didn't just survive, you built something stronger in its place. Evelyn met with him afterward in the courthouse hallway. She looked older, but also lighter. "You changed everything," she said. "You didn't have to help me that night, and yet." Marcus shook his head. "You were scared, and I had a couch. That was enough." "I want to do more," she said. "There are so many others out there. People like my father still exist. They just haven't been caught yet." "Then we catch them," Marcus replied, "one truth at a time." She nodded, and they parted ways. 2 weeks later, Evelyn launched the Morrison Fund for Legal Equity, seeded by the portion of her inheritance she'd preserved before the assets were frozen. And Marcus? He founded something too. 6 months after the arrest of Barrett Grant, a modest red brick building opened its doors on a leafy block just outside downtown Eastboro. Its sign, hand-painted but precise, read, "The Marcus Hayes Institute for Justice and Civil Defense." Inside, the scent of fresh paper and hope lingered in the air. The reception area was bright and uncluttered, a framed quote on the wall behind the desk: "When powerful people try to destroy you, tell the truth louder." Amira, now 8, was the one who picked it. She said it sounded like something her dad would whisper when he thought she wasn't listening. The Institute wasn't just a symbolic victory, it was a tactical one. Sandra had become Marcus's full-time partner in its operations. Together, they had built a pro bono legal support network for victims of economic bullying, CORPORATE, retaliation, and systemic abuse of power. They didn't wait for people to beg for help. They went looking for them. On day 1, they took on 5 cases, people whose names would never make headlines, but whose lives had been quietly shredded by landlords, employers, or city boards too confident in their own invisibility. Marcus wasn't a lawyer, but he knew how to build timelines, gather records, reconstruct threats. The hospital had taught him how to triage chaos. Now he used those same instincts to heal lives. He never asked to become a movement. But movements are rarely started by those who want power. They're sparked by people who can't afford to look away. News of the Institute spread fast. Within 3 months, they'd helped 27 families recover housing, employment, or safety. Donations poured in, so did hate mail. Marcus read every word. Not because he feared the backlash, but because he wanted to remember. This work was uncomfortable for the very people it needed to confront. Evelyn sent a message every few weeks from Seattle, where she was attending law school under her mother's maiden name. Her first message read, "Your strength gave me a new compass. One I didn't know I needed." Amira thrived. The shadows under her eyes were gone, replaced by curiosity and light. She started drawing new pictures for the office wall pictures of superheroes who looked like nurses, teachers, and women with laptops. When the city council honored Marcus with a Civic Integrity Medal, he didn't give a speech. He just held the award, looked into the crowd, and said, "I opened my door during a storm, and that door opened the rest." Across town, behind gray walls and reinforced doors, Barrett Grant sat in a cell that smelled of bleach and regret. He no longer wore monogrammed shirts or brushed his teeth with imported paste. He shared a 6x8 room with a man who didn't know who he was and didn't care. His once commanding voice had shrunk into a quiet, bitter mutter. The only thing that still tied him to the world he'd built his empire, his illusions of control, were the newspaper clippings he'd hoarded. Like relics. He read them over and over. Barrett Grant indicted in civil conspiracy case. Former billionaire caught planting evidence against single father. The headlines stung worse than any prison food or hard mattress. Because he wasn't just incarcerated, he was erased. His children stopped visiting. His lawyers stopped answering. Even his name, once synonymous with luxury and power, now surfaced only in sentences about disgrace. He wrote letters, pleas, bargains. 3 of them went to Sandra. None were answered. 1 went to Marcus. It was 4 pages long, begging for forgiveness without actually apologizing. Marcus shredded it without reading past the first line. Because redemption required understanding, and Grant still didn't get it. He still believed the only crime he'd committed was losing. But Marcus wasn't thinking about Grant anymore. He was busy organizing a case workshop for underrepresented families who had been denied housing for speaking out. Amira had helped him sort pamphlets the night before. She was getting good at alphabetizing names. "You should have been a lawyer," Sandra teased. "Nah," Marcus replied. "I think I'll just keep making sure lawyers have something worth fighting for." That afternoon, CNN called again, asking for an interview. He declined. NBC offered a documentary deal. He declined that too. Not because he was shy, but because he knew the work wasn't done. He didn't need a spotlight. He needed bandwidth. He needed more staff, more outreach, more rooms to sit with the people who had been silenced for too long. That night, after locking up the office and tucking Amira into bed, Marcus stood on the balcony and watched the city hum below. He thought about how this all began not with a strategy, but with an open door and a soaked girl who hadn't asked for anything but warmth. One act of kindness had triggered an avalanche of cruelty, but it had also triggered a blueprint for resistance. He didn't wish it had gone differently. He wouldn't change a thing. Late one Friday afternoon, as Marcus wrapped up his final consult and Amira colored quietly in the office lobby, the bell on the front door jingled. In walked a woman he hadn't seen in nearly a year. Evelyn Morrison, formerly Grant. But this wasn't the fragile runaway who had once collapsed on his doorstep during a rainstorm. This was someone remade. Her posture was strong. Her eyes steady. Her voice had a quiet gravity. "I wanted to thank you," In person, she said, folding her hands as she sat in the Institute's small waiting area. Not just for what you did for me, but for what you taught me. Marcus nodded slowly, saying nothing. He knew people needed space for their own words. Evelyn continued, "You didn't judge me. You didn't ask for anything. You protected me when I had no name. And then you kept protecting people, even after what it cost you." She paused, then opened a folder and slid it across the table. "This is the launch plan for the Morrison grant," she said. "It's a legal defense fund I've started with the last of what my father couldn't touch. It's going to support people in situations like mine. People who are targeted by power they can't fight alone." Marcus looked at the packet. Donations, mission, a 5-year commitment. It was legitimate. Strategic, real. Evelyn leaned back. "I'm studying law now. I'm not trying to make up for him. I know I can't. But I can make sure the door you opened for me keeps opening. For others." Just then, Amira ran in from the hallway. "Emma," she squealed. Evelyn blinked, then smiled. "You still remember?" "Of course," Amira said, hugging her tightly. "You made pancakes with chocolate chips." For a moment, time folded in on itself. The girl Evelyn used to be. The child Amira still was. And Marcus, steady in the center of it all, watched as 2 chapters reunited. After Evelyn left, Marcus returned to his office and stared at the framed copy of the Institute's founding charter. He remembered the panic, the storm, the threats, and how close he had come to walking away. But he hadn't, and because he hadn't, lives had changed, not just his own, but Evelyn's, dozens of families, maybe hundreds more in time. One act of empathy had ignited a transformation that no amount of wealth could stop. Not because he was trying to be noble, but because it was simply the right thing to do. The sun rose quietly over Eastborough as Marcus sat at his desk, a steaming cup of black coffee by his elbow and a case file open before him. Outside his window, the city was beginning to hum, buses sighing, school bells ringing, shop signs flipping to open. But inside the Marcus Hayes Institute, the day had already begun. In 6 months, they had helped 43 families secure housing, reverse wrongful terminations, and reclaim access to schools and medical care. 12 corrupt officials and corporate figures had been formally charged thanks to the evidence they helped. Victims gather, and behind every victory was a single unshakable truth. Injustice doesn't survive exposure. Sandra entered with her usual stack of documents and a wry smile. "Marcus, CNN wants you for that documentary again," she said. "And The Atlantic wants to do a full profile." He shook his head. "Pass. Again." She laughed. "One day, the world's going to force you into the spotlight whether you like it or not." "Let them," he replied. "But not today." He turned to the next intake report, an elderly woman being evicted for organizing a tenants' union. "Let's start with this one." Meanwhile, across town, Barrett Grant sat on the edge of a prison cot, reading the final letter from his last remaining ally, his sister, who had cut ties and changed her last name. The letter was short. "You never learned what real power is. And now you never will." He folded it, placed it beside the rest of his clippings, and lay back in silence. No calls came, no interviews, no headlines. He had become what he once used as a threat, invisible. Back at the institute, Amira skipped into the office after school, handing her father a drawing she made. It showed a tall man standing beside a small girl. Behind them, a big yellow building glowed with lights and banners. The words above it read, "Our place." "That's us," she said proudly, "and all the people we help." Marcus smiled, kissed her forehead, and pinned it next to the dozens of thank you letters and headlines. But it was Amira's words that mattered most. Later that evening, as he turned off the lights and locked the office, Marcus stepped outside and stood still for a moment. The city stretched before him, not perfect, but possible. The life he'd built wasn't revenge. It wasn't about destroying someone who tried to hurt him. It was about rising so high that their hate couldn't reach him anymore. Evelyn was now in her second year of law school. Sandra had become one of the most respected civil rights strategists in the region, and Marcus? He was the man who proved that courage doesn't shout, it documents, it outlasts, it builds. The next morning, Oxford University called to offer him a visiting position in social justice strategy. He paused, then said, "Only if I can bring my daughter." That night, he looked out his window one last time before bed. The city slept. The storm had passed, and in its place stood something no one could tear down. This was never about destroying a billionaire. It was about defending dignity. Marcus Hayes didn't win with wealth, with lawsuits, or with rage. He won with calm truth, with patience, and with a refusal to let injustice define him. In a world that often rewards silence, he chose to document. In a world that erases the vulnerable, he chose to protect. The lesson? You don't need to be powerful to fight back. You just need to be prepared. And when kindness is combined with strategy, even giants fall.